Hi, this is Bishop Craig in Northern Michigan, and this is Take One for the week of the 1st of September. Peace be with you. September 1st is when new bishop terms begin, so I am praying for all of the new bishops that are beginning this week, remembering three in particular. First, in the Rocky Mountain Synod, Bishop Megan Johnston Alabuni, once upon a time, was my student and my student assistant, and now she is my colleague in the Conference of Bishops. So I pray for Bishop Megan and her synod with a bit of pride and amazement. I'm also remembering the Indiana-Kentucky Synod in our region. My friend, now Bishop Emeritus Bill Guffian, completed his service on Sunday the 31st. And my new colleague, Bishop Tim Graham, begins today. So I am remembering Bishop Graham and Bishop Emeritus Guffian in Indiana, Kentucky in my prayers. And in a very special way, I am remembering the Allegheny Synod, which is kind of one of those synods I have developed a little bit of relationship with, because their bishop, Bishop Paula Schmidt, has resigned 3 years into her term for the sake of her own health and well-being. Being bishop can be kind of rough and tumble, so I'm remembering Bishop Paula, the Allegheny Synod, and my colleague, retired Bishop Barb Collins, who will serve as the interim bishop beginning, I think, the end of this month. So I'm remembering bishops and synods in my prayers these days. Kind of a busy week this week. Everything seems to begin. I know that's true in the synod. I'm sure it's happening in the congregations. On Tuesday, our executive committee meets at noon. And then on Tuesday evening at 7 is the first session of our adult theological education class. We have 152 people or groups registered. Pastor Amy Ruman, who's the executive for Witness in Society, and her team will be leading the course. And it will be recorded. And at Pastor Ruman's request, it will be made public. So you can look, if you're not registered for the class and want to see it, you don't get to be in the conversation or anything. You can look at our synod's YouTube page, I guess, the end of the week, I hope, and you'll be able to follow the class. And as always, if you've registered for the class, you'll get an email with a link. And we thank Director of Communications Chelsea for making all that happen. So that's Tuesday. On Wednesday, we have staff meeting, and on Thursday, we have the conference deans, and on Saturday, the Synod Council is meeting in person for much of the day. So that's the week. On Sunday, Pastor Bright, I believe, will be at Settlement in Gowan. Pastor Sprang is on call at Prince of Peace in Rose City, and I am unscheduled. So that's a brief overview of the week. The 8th of September is God's Work, Our Hands Sunday. And so I hope that you are finding great ways to celebrate what has become an important service day in our church. And I hope you will perhaps go to the Facebook community page or let Director of Communications Chelsea know what you're doing so that we can share how our synod is engaging in God's Work, Our Hands Sunday. Some positive, hopeful stuff is always good. So we thank you for your service, and we thank you for sharing. For the readings for Sunday, we kind of click into the law a little bit. The continuous readings for the first readings, which I'm reading, are from Proverbs. And I don't know how you preach on the reading, because it's just kind of wise stuff. And you kind of read it and go, yeah. And it says that our name and our reputation are to be valued more than silver and gold, and that we should not show favoritism of rich over poor. And that's right. So read some Proverbs and get some godly wisdom. The second reading is from James, and it's that classic passage that faith without works is dead. And in the context, I think that's right. We don't want to say that you need to do works to be saved, because you can't do enough works to be saved. Luther made that clear. It's about trusting God to save us. And yet, the point that James makes, if you see someone hungry, naked, and cold, and say to them, God bless you and peace be with you, and do nothing to care for their hunger, their nakedness, or their cold, what kind of faith is that? Luther would say that faith overflows in works of love. Works of love is the natural consequence of a robust faith. So there it's about putting our faith in action, if you will. God's Work Our Hands Sunday seems to fit pretty well. The other thing I think that this reading from James makes clear is that God doesn't grade on a curve. That when we fail to live up to one part of the law, we've kind of failed the whole law. So it's not, I got 70% on the quiz. It's either A or E, is the way James makes it sound, which of course leads us back into trusting God's grace, and hopefully it saves us from self-righteousness. So James, I'm still looking for good news. Then we get to the gospel reading. And here we have Jesus engaged in 2 healing encounters. The first, Jesus goes away to get away, and a woman whose daughter is possessed by a demon finds him out. Now, she is a Gentile. It's the great story of the Syrophoenician woman. And she asks for healing and for her daughter, and Jesus recognizes he's a Gentile, says something to effect, let the children eat first. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. No, we've kind of tried to apologize for Jesus, but I think Jesus was speaking the language of his day, and I think at this point in his ministry he saw himself sent to God's people, Israel, and he wanted to get away. Maybe he was at a bad day. But the woman replies, yeah, but even the dogs get the crumbs. And Jesus says, for saying that, it's been done for you. Your daughter's well. I don't think that for saying that she earned his favor. I think maybe she called Jesus up short. And he kind of went, oh yeah, and did what needed to be done. So the good news here's some good news, is that God's saving activity, God's wholeness and healing in Jesus Christ extends beyond boundaries that even we think Jesus has established. Because it seems that confronted with the boundary, Jesus steps over it. Then we have, Jesus goes on his way, and they bring to him a man who is unable to hear and who is unable to speak. And Jesus puts spittle and says to him, and he puts his fingers in his ears and says, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And here we see 2 things that I'll talk about. One, we show that Jesus cares deeply for people who live with disability. That Jesus doesn't dismiss them as unworthy or discount them as sinners who have in some way sinned and brought on God's punishment. Jesus cares for and has compassion for people who live with disabilities. And so extending the ministry of Jesus, so can we. We may not be able to bring cure, but we can bring welcome and compassion and dignity to people who live with disabilities and their families and their caregivers, And so I want to bring to your attention that our Ministry with Persons with Disabilities team is holding a learning day on October 6th at Peace Lutheran Church in Gaylord. Registration is open. We're having it in the north so that people in the north can come. And I already know that people are coming from ULC in East Lansing. At least that's what they tell me. So I am hoping that people will come so that we can all get better at extending Jesus' own ministry to persons who live with disabilities, their families, and their caregivers. So the good news is that Jesus cares about people who live with disabilities, their families, and their caregivers. And then there's another level, which the church has used, which does not negate this level, but Scripture is a deep well, and there's usually more than one meaning going on. And so in the early church, this story was heard as people preparing, or people who would be baptized at the Easter Vigil, entered the baptistry. And the bishop would touch the ears and say, "Ephphatha, be opened." And here it is to be opened to God's grace in baptism, be open to God at work in the sacraments of baptism and communion, which they would experience in one single rite at the Easter Vigil. Be opened. And I think at this time in the church's life, we could all use a ceremony that says to us, be opened to what Jesus is saying and to what God is doing, which means we need to open our ears, or have our ears open probably better, and our minds and our hearts, because God may not be preserving things as they are or moving us back to where we were. And I got to tell you, even saying that out loud makes me nervous. The story also tells us what happens when we are opened to God at work in Jesus. They tell. The people tell. They tell the story of Jesus. They tell the good news of Jesus. Their tongues are loosened and they speak of Jesus. And I would argue that our church really needs our tongues loosened so that we speak of Jesus. So again, we're doing another evangelism workshop in November to kind of help us loosen our tongues. But people, what do we do to grow our church? I don't know, but I know that if we want to grow the faith and maybe get people come to church, we should start praying out loud in worship that Jesus would loosen our tongues and free us to speak about him, maybe for starters in the church, but also in our lives and also in our world. So this is really, two-edged sword good news. When our faith overflows in works, people experience Jesus' love. When we are open to Jesus, who wants to open us, we will speak of Jesus. And the good news is God gives us faith in Christ, and Jesus opens us to be receptive to God's will. Oh, and Jesus cares about people who live with disabilities. I'm Bishop Craig. This is Take One. Welcome to fall. Now, we still have a few more weeks of summer. Welcome officially to the fall program year, and may the peace of Christ be with you always. Take care.